And okay, let's do this. So, hello everybody. We have a very special guest here. Welcome to any first-time viewers tuning in. If you're new to my stream, my name is Spilo. I'm a former Overwatch League coach. Right now, I do a lot of private stuff, a lot of content creation, a lot of hero design, theory crafting. And today, I'm joined by Alec Dawson. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hey, I'm Alec. I'm the lead gameplay designer of Overwatch 2. I'm just happy to be here, happy to have a nice long chat.
Yeah, so you were the hero designer here, and I had to check your Twitter
Yes.
when I was talking with Megan. I was like, okay, you're the gameplay designer. So talk to me about like what did that promotion look like, and what does that mean in terms of your responsibilities with the team?
Yeah, so what that really means is we have our core gameplay pillar, and I'm looking into all of the design areas within that pillar. That's heroes, that's maps, modes, events, and even working closer with our gameplay features and systems teams, like people like Gavin and Morgan, a little bit
Yeah,
closer there too. So I manage a bunch of leads in this area, make sure we're prioritizing correctly what we want to work on, and really about like planning out the next 6 months of Overwatch. Like what is
yeah,
that going to look like? Like what is it
yeah.
going to look like in the next year? What are we going to do? What are some of the bigger moments from a design standpoint that we can introduce into the game? So it's been great working with a lot more of these teams and just branching out a little bit more, working closely with a lot of really talented people, and still very close to the hero design team. That's probably the group I spend the most time with. And we're still cooking a bunch of awesome stuff coming next few months with next few hero releases. So yeah.
Yeah, yeah, looking forward to it. So, for those of you who don't know, before working on Overwatch, you worked on the Hearthstone team over at Blizzard
Yeah.
and then made the transfer over to gameplay. And I remember reading about it on Reddit and Twitter, and there's a lot of apprehension initially like, oh man, this guy doesn't know anything. He just knows card games. So, your lack of first person shooter experience definitely led to some
Mhm.
initial criticism. But overall, I think you've been pretty well received, especially considering the difficulty of the position that you were put in. What were some initial challenges in the early days of the job? Do you feel like your unique background helped you in any ways?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of normal challenges. Like whenever you join a new team, new environment, it's like you come over and you're like, okay, what can I do best? Like, how can I best serve this team? And what skills that I bring is going to be best here, right? So I think a lot
Right.
of that early on was just looking at, okay, how can we spread awareness of like what the hair design team is doing, communicate better within our teams, work a lot with Kenny Hudson, our producer, to make sure like we're getting our process like more formalized, and then talking more about like the philosophies that we have, like going into the future, like how we're going to build things. And like how we're going to actually like structure things so we can like hold ourselves to it.
Right.
And I think that's really important, like making sure that there's just like phrases and sayings that are like, hey, this is the way we do things, and then those become pillars that we can start to like argue against and argue for, and then come back to like every periodic, like every few months, like, is this still something we want in the game? Is this still the thing that
Yeah.
we believe in? Because it's been dictating some of our decision making, or at least influencing our decision making.
Sure.
So doing a lot of things like that, but I think it was pretty daunting in the beginning. I think probably the biggest thing was you're now responsible for all of these people's work in some way, right? A lot of
Right.
very talented people, and you're getting in front of people and talking about it, right?
Yeah.
And so I was always very, I loved Overwatch. I played a lot of competitive games growing up. I played a lot of shooters growing up. I went to a bunch of OWL matches, but it wasn't like I wasn't didn't have like the complete download of Overwatch at that time and point because I was working on other things, and that's where like most of my
Yeah.
time was like I couldn't name you the top five ball players. I probably name like the top two at the time, right? Or something like that. So you come in, you start to download, you start to ask a bunch of questions because it's your responsibility now. So like I would spend a lot of time in those early days with Josh, just being like, okay, why do we make all these changes?
This is
What is the
Josh
intent
Snow,
to
right?
Josh? No, yeah, our
Yeah.
lead balance designer. So, and we were just like, he was gracious enough to give me a bunch of his time. Like we'd sit there for 2 hours and just talk through like his intent and his philosophies, and try to understand like what are we doing on the team and where we're going to go in the future. So, but yeah, background wise, fairly holistic. I worked on a bunch of different things. I started in mobile, working a bunch of stuff. And when you're in a small studio, it's like 5, 6 people. You just do a bunch of different things. Like I did puzzle
Yeah.
design and also like did business agreements for an arcade cabinet. That's in like Dave and Buster's, right? It's like, okay, those are really different things, right, from the day to day. And then coming over to Hearthstone, like design over there at that point in time was pretty holistic as well. Like we would be doing VO recordings, we'd be doing art descriptions, we'd be writing all the lines, not just like all the words on the cards. So we were doing a
Yep.
bunch of stuff. So I think that helped out a little bit coming over to Overwatch in the sense of, I care a lot about not just the mechanics of our heroes, but how they're presented.
Of
Being able to
course.
have conversations with our VFX teams, our sound teams, our animation teams, and just understanding at least enough of their language that you can, give quality feedback, listen to them, and ask good questions.
I feel like that's part of leadership as well. I think we live in a very specialized world right now, but a little bit of diversification can really help you to lead your team effectively, I find.
Yeah, yeah, and then on the design time, it's just something you learn. I think like the way I've always done this thing where I like end up like creating like little metaphors for like what I'm designing on at that particular moment. Like Hearthstone was this puzzle where you had to have like hundreds of pieces, and like how did they come together? And all the pieces had to be great, right? Overwatch is a lot of backwards and forwards. There's still this framework of a puzzle, and we spend a good amount of time figuring out what that framework's going to look like. But a lot of times that's in our prototyping phase, which is 3 months or whatever.
Right.
And that's not the hardest part. The hardest part is like, okay, now we have 4 pieces of this puzzle. They have to be perfect. They have to be rich and full enough. They have to be clear enough, and they have to be. And that's all you have. Like, you don't get to. It's really easy to make a kit that like does a certain thing if you like keep adding and adding and adding and adding. But it's like what Overwatch is about is like this very concise framework of design.
You're tempting me with those 4 things. I will stay on script, but if you want to elaborate on those 4 things,
no, I'm talking more of it's like here's all the pieces of your kit.
Oh,
right?
I see.
Like, here's what you get to work with. So these abilities need to be versatile enough. They need to be clear enough. They need to make sense. And it's just like it's just making a diamond. We're just making it as perfect as possible.
I see what you're saying. It's a lot more precise. A lot more precise. Okay.
Yeah.
So we talked about this a little bit already, coincidentally, which was the communication. Just putting you on a pedestal, talking a lot more. And I don't know how familiar you are with Overwatch's past, and there was a lot of great things. But one of the things that I was always very critical of was the communication. It just felt like there was a clear gap between the development team and the community. And I feel like in many ways that gap has closed significantly, which is great for me because I get to know what's going on. There's a lot more communication, there's a lot more transparency, but it also means that there's a lot more vulnerability on your end. I understand how that can be to a small extent. How do you deal with that? Because every single time, I made a joke about it the last time you tweeted, every single time you tweet, there's just a list of like a laundry list of people that are asking for this and complaining and griping and snapping at you and calling you names. How do you deal with that level of pressure?
Yeah, I mean, I think you definitely develop a little bit of a skin. But the way, and by the way, I think we do a good job of communicating. I think we can do even better. I think like we can do even better about it. And I think this is great. We're gonna get through a bunch of questions and everything. I think it's really about developing a filter. I think you have to understand like, okay, what is this person trying to say? What does it like? You stop taking feedback at exactly face value, and you kind of like filter it through. And you're like, okay, like I understand where the feedback's coming from. I understand the emotions. I understand what they want, and like how can we act on this to make something that's good. So you just like hear a lot. We talk to our community team a lot. Make sure that they're giving us reports about like where sentiment is, what are some of the hot topics. But I think even as designers, we're reading all of it too. Like we see it. We see it on YouTube. We see it on Reddit. We see it on Twitter. We see it wherever it is. But it's just about developing a filter and sort of getting this like, okay, here's kind of what the community's saying. Here's the hot button issues. Here's some things they're talking about. Here's some really good arguments, and starting to like how that kind of breeds. And then you talk about it as a team.
Sure.
But I think there's standard things like slightly less social media time, things like that. That do help. Like taking Twitter off your phone is probably a good one. That's probably a good thing to do.
That is a good one. So I guess we could talk about a little bit about season 11 here. Because obviously there's a lot of things that have changed, a lot of balance tweaks, Cassidy update, new map, even a map rework, which obviously we've talked about that one a lot. But what are you most excited about and why?
I mean, the glass, right? The glass. No, I think that was great.
I gotta know. How did you guys find that clip?
How do we find? We see every clip. Everything that comes up, right? But Rusabi is a really beautiful map. I think it does a lot of good things for like push and sort of it has a lot of design lessons of things that we learned. And here's some things we learned in terms of design of push maps. Here it is. But I think Cassie is the biggest one. Magnetic Grenade, we all know, wasn't very beloved. So it was something that we wanted to touch for quite a bit of time. And I think now he just has a much more understandable and natural threat radius. Like there was times where Magnetic Grenade like whoop, come back behind you and hit you or trap you to a certain extent where you just like didn't expect it. And there's like that slight delay. And that's just more instant and you understand the engagement a lot better, with Cassidy. And I think it's something that's just like quality of life for us. It just feels really good mechanically. I think it feels better to approach it too.
Yep.
So.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Great. Were there any specific goals that you wanted to accomplish besides the individual things? Or any holistic like this patch we'd like to address this larger scale issue, or is it more of like a lot of little small things like the glass?
Tell me like the balance patch overall.
Yeah, just this season 11 overall. Yeah.
Yeah, I think like hitting top meta, that was one of the goals, shifting power around, and also some heroes that haven't, gotten changes in a bit or have been lost by some recent changes. If you look at the top meta stuff, we're talking like Kiriko and Sojourn have been around and very prominent for a long time. And I think Sojourn, we've kind of actually started to see like she's actually hit that power level threshold or lower than the threshold where, okay, her popularity is dropping. It is actually dropping at like a rapid rate in terms of where she's going to end up compared to where she's been for basically her entire existence in Overwatch 2.
Yep.
Roadhog is pretty popular, when there are sharper mechanics. I think we don't want to see a certain popularity level. We try not to play favorites. We try to be quite impartial, but at the same time, with how survivable he was, and in terms of he has this combo and everything, I think he was seeing very popular rates even at the highest levels of play, right? So we wanted to get that a bit more stabilized too. When it comes to the shifting levels of power, Sojourn's a good example. Illari's a good example of, hey, where can we push a little bit? We take out some power in their kit or push some power in their kit into places where we think they might fill a better role. Sojourn was really kind of shifting that around, and I think we actually have a better base to work off of with this wherever our gun is now. We can inject some in the future,
Right.
Yeah. And then
not just tweaking balance strength, but like shifting things around, like gears within the kit, even if they're at the same strength, but a healthier version of that strength. Maybe.
Yeah, and she took a nerf, right? Like she did get nerfed, but I think there's a lot more we can do with her now, right? Looking at spread, looking at some other things, and then Symmettra, Diva, Reaper, just characters that got a little lost. Some of those got lost in the armor changes. Symmettra just got lost in terms of there was the brief Mauga meta that we reacted to very quickly, and we wanted to make sure she got addressed a little bit in this patch and give her a little love. So
okay, perfect. So I guess going back to the glass, we've been seeing a lot of Map Reworks. Got the opportunity to talk with Ryan Smith in LA, and he was very excited talking about all these things that are going on behind the scenes. So what puts a map as under the microscope as needing a rework? It's not like a hero that has too high of a win rate. What are your subjective, objective, whatever measures that highlight a map as being quote unquote problematic besides some funny hair guy screaming about it for 10 minutes?
Well, I mean, feedback is important, right? But we do some surveys and rounds of that where we get a lot of feedback from the community of which maps they like, which maps they don't like, which modes they like, which modes they don't like. So that informs some of our targets. But a lot of those targets kind of lined up with our own intuition of like some things that needed updated.
Sure.
There's also just like the game's change in some of the design sets that over time, right? I think we understand where some of the pain points are. Some of our philosophies of how we actually build out levels are a little bit different. Like there's some older maps that just have these really, really brutal choke points, right? And a lot of the newer maps are a bit more breathable. There's some that's a little bit looser. There's a lot more flank routes, things like that. We want to make sure like we open up some of those old maps to allow you to have better approaches, right? And that's something we're doing, in the season 13 map rework cycle, where there's going to be a variety of maps that are getting like more access to different pathways, right?
Sure.
So those are some of the things we utilize to make sure that we're targeting the right maps. It's just like community feedback, some of the survey stuff, some of the things that we just want to bring some of our new design philosophies forward to some of the older maps too.
Got it. Okay. Do you feel like you applied any of those with the Runasapi?
Runasapi in particular is a lot of learnings. I think there's certain things with run back times that are polished compared to how they were previously. There's a lot more direct, simple pathways to get back into the fights. If you look at around some of the points, they're a lot more open in terms of like where you get the forward spawn and forward checkpoint to get you the forward spawn. Those are a lot more open compared to some of the other ones. So there's a lot more like cover. You can get around back a little bit more easily. And then there's when you come into the final stretch, it's more of like a traditional choke, right? Yeah. Rather than some of the other maps where you kind of like you turn the corner in Toronto and it's like super open, right? Yeah. It's just like, and a lot of teams get a little lost there, and they're like, wait, like we can get up the hill, but then we don't know how to get it like into this last straightaway, and that's always been like a really big problem push, where a lot of teams don't actually end the game. The push can be this thing where it's like, okay, we'll get it back to here, but then it's like it feels like we don't know what to do at this point in time because it's really hard to get that last 10%, right?
Yes.
So those are some of the things that we changed there. I think a lot of like really just great lessons, and I think as we release maps for modes that, the first batch of them we learned a lot, and then we applied to the next one. Like right now we're, looking at the next Flashpoint map and some of the lessons we've learned from, some of the earlier ones and how we can apply those.
Yeah, of course. Okay. So in September 2023, you mentioned in a director's take that new heroes should be launched on the safe side of strong.
Mm-hmm.
How would you assess that slogan on some of the more recent characters? Too strong, not strong enough? With all the future characters now being available at launch, does that change that approach either as well? Because now every character is apparently immediately accessible.
Yeah, so let's go through like Illari, actually like in the ballpark. I think there
Yep.
was a little bit of artificial numbers that we pushed in terms of like her primary fire and the ult.
Yep.
But Illari was right in the ballpark where we want. So what
Mm-hmm.
we're really shooting for is like right around 55, 57. So it's a little bit higher than we would normally do, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, Mauga, so too pushed too far. Actually, the trial was much more like at this average point, and I think we reacted a little bit too heavily. And then some of the things we introduced, I think he just got a little bit too takey overall in terms of
Mm-hmm.
his launch. So pushed a little bit too far, and then Venture right in the ballpark again. Venture launch we look at. We loved how it went actually. I think throughout their whole launch period, they were like a top three DPS. And even after we did the initial round of nerfs, they were still quite strong.
Mm-hmm.
And then the further tweaking got them into a really good place that they're still like in that like during the month of it was Venture fourth, right, the whole season. So during that month, we want to make sure Venture was pretty popular, get a lot of play rate, and that was successful. Venture right now
Awesome.
is still in that like that top group of DPS, can get a lot of value, and we feel really good about how that went. Um, so your question is like, do we keep the slogan how it's going?
Yeah,
I think
I
it's
assume.
yeah. Go ahead.
No, I assume that's you continue with that moving forward.
Yeah, I think it's pretty like clear what our intentions are, and I like being clear with our community. Like, hey, this is like how we're going to launch heroes, and then we'll peel them back a little bit over time,
Sure.
but we want to make sure that window is really exciting. If anything,
Sure.
I think looking at how Venture went, we we may have actually we're like, hey, do we actually let that initial launch period last even longer? Because I think a lot of people like after those 2 weeks, they didn't have like the fondest. They're like, why are you nerfing Venture? Venture's so much fun. It was like, well, Venture's really, really strong, and you have this responsibility to try to get things into like a certain range, but at the same
Right.
time, I think we could have maybe let that go slightly longer. And then with new heroes launching, I think our trials help here a lot, right? Our trials give us that early look where we feel confident
Sure.
enough that we can launch those heroes into competitive, on day one, or it just gives us like, is anything out of whack, right? Or is
Yeah, I
anything,
get you.
yeah. And I think that's been really good. And that was something, after Lifeweaver, that's really helped a lot with all the hero releases where we can get them into a much better spot and we can react pretty quickly.
Yeah, yeah. Speaking of Lifeweaver, we talked about support characters. One of the questions
Hmm.
is talking about utility with support specifically and how,
Yeah.
especially in higher ranks, a lot of the times we often see the same supports generally staying meta. Baptiste, Kiriko, Lucio, characters that are generally considered to have higher skill ceilings. And that's normal for a lot of games, right? But I think one of the problems is that a lot of the lower skill, at least perceived lower skill supports, is that they just don't have competitive utility. Is that something that you're looking to address with future support characters? Is that something that we're continuing evaluating current support characters? Kind of an
Well,
open-ended question.
yeah, if we look at it right now, I think if you look at Illari recently, she's actually climbing a ton at the highest ranks right now, right? I think it's about making some of those heroes what their niche is just a bit more strong and more
Right,
unique.
right,
So I think like some of those changes were geared like she is going to hold points better. She's going to hold like chokes and different things a little bit better. Turret's going to be a little bit harder to destroy. It's going to heal the team up more, a little bit better in the poke comp, perhaps, rather
right,
than some of the flanking style that she was getting the benefit from the turret previously.
right.
So making sure they're playing a little bit more towards different places. I think we, at the same time, we're okay with certain heroes not like ever reaching the highest levels of competitive play. I think like Moira in particular, like we're okay with some heroes being a little bit more simple to understand, a little bit more approachable, and we've done a lot of work behind the scenes, like trying to think of utility for Moira and play with utility for Moira,
Yeah,
but it all kind of distracted from like the main gameplay loop that people kind of love and they've attached to. So I don't think that means that's what we'll do forever. I think that means just kind of like we'll spend a lot of time on something, see if it's worth it, and if an idea comes later, we'll reapproach it again.
Yeah. Are projectile heroes on that list as well? Because historically, projectile heroes in Overwatch 1 kind of fell into two categories, which was spammy, just kind of throw it all the damage down the choke, or high utility, right? You look at a character, even if you look at almost every projectile character, they have some form of utility, whether it's a scouting, it's a trap, it's a boop, a wall. And it feels like in Overwatch 2, some of that utility has maybe fallen off in terms of value. And so a lot of the projectile characters struggle to compete because their mouse ones aren't always as effective. Are projectile heroes, I guess, not necessarily specifically, but are some projectile heroes on that list of characters that you guys are going to continue to look at?
Yes, but at the same time, I'll challenge them a little bit. I do think a projectile heroes, some of them are really strong right now. I think
Yeah,
like
Pharah
Pharah is really strong. Bench is pretty strong. I think it may not feel like that just because Cassidy is so popular right now. Cassidy's really like just the line keeps going up a little bit on Cassidy. But same with Pharah. Pharah I think in the last 3 weeks has like tripled her play rate. So people are finally like latching onto the rework and everything. So I do think there's a little bit to be done for some of them. I think like Hanzo in particular. Hanzo's the one we've been talking about in terms of he's kind of lost his identity within the cast. We look at Storm Arrow is the place to look is in terms of bringing back some of the one shot for certain thresholds, and that's some of the stuff we're playing with at the moment. I think we previewed this a little bit ago. We're actually playing with some changes for to bring some characters that are a bit more squirrely to 225 and seeing how that goes. And it does benefit Hanzo at that point. He becomes the character that can actually be very, very effective against some of those characters. But I think he's on our list right now of what's his identity going to be in the future, and we're working on him actively at the moment.
So tying almost back into where you're okay with certain characters maybe not being able to compete as well. This one's going to be, follow me with this one. It's going to be a little bit of a rabbit trail here. So one of the critical tenets of human psychology is that we often take the easy way out. We're risk averse. We don't like going for the most necessarily effective option. We want the most accessible option. And I feel like that reflects itself oftentimes in metas. For example, ranked meta generally is more poke oriented than pro meta. Characters like Illari, Torbjorn, Mauga, Sigma, and so on. Do you guys factor that into balance at all? Because oftentimes when people complain about a meta, it will be with those characters that just, they just deny anything that I want to do. I try to go in, I try to make an engagement. They deny that. We see that with Illari, we see that with Torbjorns, we see that with some of the Roadhogs and things like that. Playstyle flexibility is important, but humans do tend to the passive option, and that punishes the active heroes. Do you guys factor that in at all? Like I said, very open-ended question, but it seems that a lot of the more tempo, fast, movement-oriented characters sometimes are quote-unquote countered by characters that don't have to put in that same level of effort.
Yeah, I think if we look at a few things like, our lower skill heroes, tend to be, more consistent, but the higher skill ones, they have a payoff that's there, right? And I think that's really important for us. But also just looking at how heroes can be more proactive, how we can introduce more risk. That's something we've been looking at for a number of heroes. I think like looking at that right now for Mauga, right? I think Mauga is actually in this interesting place where he plays really well in like a highly coordinated environment. But I think if you look at him, like otherwise it's kind of the same play style that you've seen previously to some extent, right? But how can we introduce a little bit more risk for a little bit more value for going in and getting some of that? Venture was one during development that was pretty interesting. For a while, Venture had this primary fire where they would same primary fire, but you'd shoot it and then broke into shrapnel, right? And a lot of that was because players wouldn't they didn't know what to do when they couldn't hit something that was like more than 15 meters away. They're just like, hey, how do I go in? What do I do? Like how do I poke this turret? And so for a long time we gave this primary fire. It's like, oh, now I can poke the turret, but then people just weren't doing the combo stuff. They were kind of just hanging back, even though they weren't getting the value, right?
Right.
Even though it was purposely weak, right? But that's what people would do. Because we're like, no, we have to cut that. We got to go back to like this primary fire where there is very restricted, and you are going to be encouraged to go in. And the shields, the temporary shields, kind of help that and encourage that a little bit. Where you are going to be, there's at least a little bit of protection there, right? You can be a little tanky during these moments. So yeah,
that's interesting. So you did notice the fact that people, if given the option, will do nothing. You have to kind of force them to do things.
Oh yeah.
But it feels so rewarding. I love Venture. Like I've loved playing Venture. So okay, continuing off this. This is all the negative stuff because this is all the hero designs, the stuff I cry about, right? So does the team prioritize balancing / managing heroes that are more universally hated? Because we love to have every character be relatively well received. But for example, Tracer has been at least soft meta for quite a long time. I mean, it feels like since season 9. And I've definitely seen some complaints. But compared to, for example, when Roadhog, Mauga, those characters were meta for a significantly shorter period of time, people are pulling their hair out. Does that factor in at all into your decisions as a designer?
It does. I think there's like some things at play, right? I think like tanks get a lot more attention while the gameplay kind of like goes through them. They kind of set the rules of engagement to some extent. And then Mauga and Roadhog have some more sharp mechanics, like they're very survivable. They can blow people up rather quickly in the right sort of time frame. But yes, I do think heroes have like a threshold or a half-life to how long they can be, meta, before we need to come in and act. And those differ greatly, right? There was this term on Hearthstone, I think like someone in the community like coined it, was called like a grievance rate, where it's okay, certain decks are going to have certain grievance rates, and if they're more popular, like they can't be popular for so long unless and our job is to come in kind of like make sure some of those frustrations actually go down, right? But if you see it like once in every X amount of games, it's okay. So I do think there's things that can live as long as they're not, the thing you see every single game, right? If you saw Widowmaker every single game, I think, that may not be the best for us. But we like Widow in certain maps. We like Widow, like players being able to pull up these really skillful moments. And I think it creates like an interesting relationship. But if it was every game, I think we'd have to come in, right?
Mm-hmm. I remember talking about this with you in LA, and you said everything's okay to be meta occasionally. The variety itself is okay. And maybe that's especially considering compared to something like a League of Legends where there's so many heroes, right? Overwatch kind of does need to cycle through characters as we're expanding that kit. So I said on my chat I was going to ask any targeted hero questions, but I'm going to ask one. And there's a reason behind it because I think it's a good litmus test for your approach to other things. Because I have been a grouch about the Wrecking Ball, some of the discussion around Wrecking Ball. Because my problem with Wrecking Ball has been that he has infinite survivability until he doesn't. Until you have that Somber Hack or the Sleep Dart or Discord or whatever else, then he just melts. And if I love the what was it, the retract change. I love the adaptive shields change. I think all that stuff has been really fun and added an even higher level of skill and value. But some things that still remain is that the guy still dies to CC and he has no way of counterplaying it. And if you don't have CC, he's basically almost unkillable. He doesn't have a head hitbox half the time and so on. So when you're finding a character like Wrecking Ball that's struggling, sometimes I don't always fully understand when it feels like some of the changes don't address weaknesses. Is it that you want these characters to have very defined weaknesses and are okay with that? Or is that, or because my argument is that some of these weaknesses are almost too strong, right? That becomes the definition of the character's identity. Do you guys have any philosophy when it comes to that? Do you disagree, agree? It's just my perspective.
Wrecking Ball in particular?
Sure, Wrecking Ball in particular, but I think this also applies to characters like Mauga and Roadhog and other characters.
Yeah, I think overall, we want clear strengths and weaknesses. I think that's sort of like what Overwatch is built on and allows people to understand the game, very well, very quickly. I think the one thing, we talk about pretty frequently is like how extreme should those be?
Of course.
And right now, we're looking at Wrecking Ball. We're trying some things I'm looking at, but I think we're looking at more of the side of like, hey, should some of these abilities just not be as effective on tanks? Looking at Sleep Dart again, we're looking at Hack. Like maybe Hack should take a little bit longer to hit on a tank, and then Wrecking Ball can use his mobility to make sure he's like out of range, things like that. But we do want to make sure that he's not like doesn't have too much CC, just play against CC, because I think at that point, like in certain thresholds and ranks, like players aren't going to be able to actually do anything against it. But we want to I think there's a way to smooth it out though a little bit. Yeah.
Right. I would be curious to see how that works out, because I think would you be able to return that ability to make it harder for CC to be effective on tanks? Would that then come counterbalanced by reducing his effective HP? I know this is a very specific question, but is that on the table?
Yeah, I think so.
Because it's
I
like a
think
little from column A, a
yeah,
little come from B. He's got to
yeah.
give and take, right?
I think to an extent. I think Wrecking Ball right now, actually, when we look at him compared, we have these like very pretty broad measures of like survivability and looking at the cast overall. And we look at like how it went from like season 8 to season 9, and like a lot of folks went down, right? Because that was part of the intent. We took a bunch of healing out of the game. Wrecking Ball is actually the one character right now that is one of the few characters that actually is more survivable than he was previously,
Right.
right? So I think there is a little room to maybe possibly decrease some of the HP and things like that to see if he does get out of hand, right?
Okay.
When we decrease some of the other things
Of
that maybe
course.
affected him.
Of course. And this feels like a natural question to follow because I want to ask about that topic. I want to ask about dynamism when it comes to balancing, because a common criticism of it's ironic because it feels like many of the Overwatch 2 heroes have fallen into the Kiriko Sojourn category, where they don't have necessarily any super strongly defined strengths or weaknesses, but they have some here and there, at least initially. And then you have characters like Mauga and Lifeweaver who have extremely well-defined strengths and weaknesses. So do you guys have a philosophy when it comes to hero design? Do you want to find somewhere in between? Obviously you said how defined weaknesses is very important. What is your approach to hero design? Has that changed over the course of like the last year and a half?
Yeah, I think players want less hard counters, and I think a lot of the older designs certainly lean to like very,
Yes.
very hard counters, right?
Yes.
At the same time, I do think we've made some safe designs. I think there's some heroes that we've made, that have just been almost too well rounded. They kind of do a little bit of everything, and you wonder like, how do I approach this character in particular? So yeah, there was a certain, especially on our supports. I think if we
Yeah.
look at like even like Illari, you go like Outburst. It's like, oh, like Ilari's like this poke hero and has this turret, and then also has like a get off of me button too. That can be, I like that it's like, has this mobility as well. That's kind of nice to have like that bimodal thing. But we had this, we have our different goals for each role, and one of the ones we had at the beginning of Overwatch 2, and this is really due to a lot of the feedback at the time, was that support heroes would be scrappy. They could like fight back a little bit more, because what we were seeing in those early days, right? We've since scrapped the scrappy goal, so that's no longer around. But that was something I think that Illari was a part of. It was just like, oh yeah, she's gonna be able to like survive by herself a little bit and make sure because she can really good. But if anything, like that character should be able to be dove a little bit more easily, right?
Do you mind if I ask you like why you scrapped that, and is there a philosophy that's replaced that?
Yeah, I think it just became this. I think when we look at sort of the dynamic between the roles, I don't. Its support should still be able to like, they still be able to deal damage, still be able to defend themselves, but they got too good at it. We think, right? There's too much survivability baked into it. After you would get to, part of the goal is like getting to the support in the back line, right? Like that should be like part of the challenge and the hard part sometimes, right? And we look at things like Zen Kick and like how good that was as like a get off me as well. So I think there was an extent we just went too far, right? In that way. So I think right now, even we look at some of the some of the feature supports where, hey, we can claw back a little bit like our next year is a lot of mobility, but we're making like a even down the line support, and we're like, hey, maybe we don't need like support can have a little bit more lower mobility. Like maybe if they don't need to actually fight back when they're in close range a little bit. But I think we gave a little bit that too much to everyone at a certain point in time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
How do you feel? Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. Okay, so community here, and this seems like a good time to ask this question based off of that. So everyone has the opinion when it comes to player feedback. We talked about how you guys are very aware of it. You guys get feedback from even within your own community team, but people aren't necessarily going to agree with each other on what needs to change. What are the most important sources of feedback for you guys? If I'm like a random plat player and I think I've got a brilliant rework, it's basically you guys are inaccessible. But how do you guys feel that you're able to stay in touch with the community without necessarily exposing yourself to every single harebrained idea floating out there?
It's like about not having blind spots. I think if we only read like one source of feedback, we're only going to get the same sort of feedback to some extent, right?
Yeah.
Or from the same sort of like players, or because they kind of think alike a lot of times. To make sure like we're getting feedback from high level players, and make sure we're getting feedback from low level players. That happens even in our testing, like when we run external tests, right? We'll make sure we get a range of players so we can get feedback of like, okay, is this approachable? It also is like there are a lot of skillful things here. I think overall, it's also about like finding where like feedback is consistent in terms of it's kind of like this thing that like, okay, can you trust where it's coming from? Does it have a
Yep.
viewpoint? Does it criticize you when you make mistakes? Does it also like cheer you on when you do good things? And I think that's like really important. That's what I kind of personally look for is like,
Okay.
okay, like I can like kind of trust this feedback because I know like where this person's coming from. I know how they feel, or I know like where with this group of people, like what their values are, and like this doesn't align here because of this. Okay,
Right.
like it just allows you to make more sense of it,
Yeah.
and really take it to heart a bit faster.
Sure, sure. So when you're implementing these ideas, I feel like recently there's been, honestly, frankly, a lot of experimentation. Like you guys have done some
Hmm.
crazy stuff. It's been whether it's the quick play hacked or even some of the event stuff that's been put under the just put under these new events and mirror watch. But there's just been a lot of like felt like very very aggressive patches, a lot of very aggressive experiments. Something that is really refreshing to me, I think, what was it, the Brigitte stat, 26, 27 nerfs before she finally fell out of meta over the course of like two. It just felt like many times the Overwatch 1 team was very glacial, excuse me, when it came to their approach. But you guys have been much more aggressive, much more open to taking risks, and then seemingly doing a good job at dialing back when those risks failed. Is this a conscious decision for you guys? Was this a philosophical change when you joined on, or is this more of a recent development?
Um, Basically since the start of Overwatch 2, we've always wanted to make sure like seasons can be these big shakeups.
Sure.
I think over time though we've allowed ourselves to just react quicker to things and be a bit more liberal with that. We're like, okay, if it doesn't work out, we're going to pull back a bit faster than we may have
Of course.
previously. So that allows us to experiment a bit more, push a bit more. I think we could even be doing more there though. I think one of the things that's challenging, I think, for the balance team at the moment is like there's a lot of these like bespoke changes that occur, and like we had to do like a lot of testing to make sure that these actually get in like a pretty good place to be presentable and things of that nature. And then I wish we had more gameplay systems that we could like inject change into. Right? I wish there
Right.
was an easier way for us to inject wide change very quickly, and not just on the I'm not necessarily just talking about passives. I'm talking about just like what other gameplay systems can we have in Overwatch that allow change to be more rapid and allow it to come in a bit more easily,
Yeah.
because like it can be a lot of work to do one patch that changes the whole meta
Of
with
course.
things that feel new and things that feel right for the characters as well, right?
Of course, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm a big fan. I think obviously it's exciting to have new things as a content creator to talk about. But for me, coming from somebody who's been involved in a lot of coaching and stuff like that and leadership, it I think taking risks is required. You have to be willing to take risks. Otherwise, if you play it safe, you don't learn anything. And I very much for one appreciate that. So
Yeah, I think
when
season 9 was a big example of us taking some
perfect,
risks.
right? Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly, exactly. And sometimes you're going to have to take the criticism, right, when you do something wrong. But I feel like for the most part, I've been a huge proponent of that as a fundamental philosophy change. And when you're trying these changes out, you guys have talked about your internal testing and many of those other things. Do you think that there's a way that you have a method or a specific way that you test out these changes? Do you think that that method could be improved? Because I think a lot of that is kind of like it's a mystery. It's behind the curtain. How do they come up with these ideas? Well, how do they test these ideas? How do they come up with these numbers? And some of those things come with criticism, right? Lifeweaver's release, a lot of people, myself included, was like, man, how is this testing with this character done? So, but at the same time, then you guys come up with really really good idea, and it's like, okay, then how did they come up with this idea? How is this tested? So it's like, what is your current internal testing, and how is it done? And would you like to see that improved?
Yeah, I mean, one of the ways we come with balance changes, we talk about the goals, for the
Sure,
next patch. I think right
sure,
now we're looking at doing a bigger tank patch. And it's like, okay, this is
okay,
going to be the goals of this patch to get tanks into a place we think that they're feeling a bit better overall.
sure,
Um, and Josh and the balance team they'll talk over those changes. We'll playtest those quite a bit throughout the few weeks that we have. We'll get like a group that's a bit more competitive minded. Like, okay, we're actually in comms, like trying to
right,
like actually like stress test some of these things, and then we'll have like bigger review sessions. So I think that's a pretty good process as long as we can be reactive. As long as we can be
sure.
pretty fast when these things go out, because well, once you get those changes into the live environment, there may be things that are slightly unexpected.
There's
Most of the
millions of
changes fall in.
players. So
Yeah,
much more stress testing,
yeah. But we're also, there's historical things of, lessons we learned over time about like, okay,
Yes,
what is
of
this type
course,
of change going to do to this hero in terms of their viability, right?
of
Um,
course.
and we've had blind spots, but we've tried to improve those things over time. I think you
Sure.
mentioned Lifeweaver. Part of that was getting some of those more competitive oriented playtests on the books.
Mm.
Another thing was controller. I think that was one of our biggest blind spots for Lifeweaver. I know there's some clunkiness in terms of its controls and release, but on console we think that was even worse. So it was like, oh, we just missed that, and so now it's like every few weeks there's control play just to make sure we're doing our due diligence, on that platform where it's a large part of our player base, to making sure that experience feels right too.
Okay.
That's it's just about like patching up some of those things as we go, making sure our testing process gets better and better.
Sure. So when you're talking about a lot of things that you've learned, are there any perspectives, philosophies, ideas that have changed in your last year and a half since you've been here?
I think some of the things that, like from a balance standpoint at least, that are interesting about Overwatch is, and we talked about this in the AMA a few weeks ago, was how hard it can be for a hero's performance perception to shake off. I'm talking about like characters like Sojourn and Kiriko and things like that, where if players believe that they're good at only like we're talking about the top of the top of the top, that they're good everywhere, right? And it's like,
Right.
oh, interesting, and I think that was something that was learned over time for me, and it was like, oh, like interesting. Y'all think Sojourn is this, and we understand why she's really good at like the higher levels, but she's very, very popular everywhere else too. And there's satisfaction that's wrapped into that as well. So I think that was an interesting thing. But some things have just been confirmed, like over time. Uh, Metas are very, how do I say this in a way? It's like they're not necessarily like static, right? They're
Yeah.
not these things that are like set in stone. It's actually kind of like this. It's very social things about like how people play in an environment. Like metas are very different from region to region. Like Korea plays a lot more Ana, and they do much better on Ana as well. So it's not just about like these are the perfect things. It's about, hey, what do this large group of people latch onto, and then what do they start playing more and more and more so they get better at the thing? It's not that this is actually the perfect configuration. Like you could do a balance patch 3 times, and you may end up with like slightly different results based on like how the players what they latch onto
Right.
first.
Right.
And I think you even saw that like in Owl, like where like it was about sometimes it was about the team that found a strategy that worked
Yes.
first, like the best team, and that was the strat. It
Yep.
doesn't mean
Yep.
this is like necessarily the perfect strat, but that was going to be the meta.
It feels even harder for you too, because it feels like the perception of a lot of times the higher ranked players trickles down because they are the community leaders, and so a lot of times there'll be a perception around a certain character that actually really doesn't matter all that much in lower ranks, but the lower ranks will still parrot or force or change their playstyle to match the opinion of the higher ranked player.
Oh,
It feels
totally.
like such a
Yeah.
hard dynamic to balance around.
Yeah, yeah, and it's I think yeah, but as I said earlier, like the recent thing to me is the most interesting. It's like Roadhog doesn't get played in Korea, and Roadhog gets
Yeah.
played like in EU and NA, like
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
if you
Yeah.
actually
Yeah.
look like on the ladder, it's like much higher. So it's so interesting how we, as players, we sort of like form this idea of what this thing is, even though it's kind of just where it's all just who latched onto something first, and then it kind of evolved from there, right?
Right. Right. Right.
Yeah,
So we're going to move into some game design questions here. So there's
yeah,
been a lot of
cool.
discussion around role passives, the psychology of
Mhm.
whether free value feels earned, or is that a necessary something that the game needs to incorporate or not, and whether painting with a broad passive brush is awkward. The recent JQ change you guys did is a great example of how like finding workarounds with the tank passive that you guys have felt that tank is needed.
Yeah,
There's been a lot of criticism around passives, whether it's the DPS passive, crucially a lot of the tank passive changes about whether it's balance, whether it feels good, whether it's necessary, whether how it should be incorporated. I assume this is something that you guys are aware of. Do you guys have any plans on further tweaks to passives? Do you have has your approach to passives changed? Very broad question here.
yeah. So one of the big reasons they're there is that we like having some consistent behavior across a role, so you understand like what you're getting into in that engagement. I do think there's some things we want to tune a little bit with the passes, but I will say like when we're looking at our next patch, I think the thing we want to lean on most is making sure like the heroes themselves feel more active, they have more playmaking ability, and that's where you're feeling the change. I don't think you don't, as a tank, you don't necessarily feel every single passive tuning mark.
Right.
You might feel the 30 to 50% of the knockback, but you may, from game to game, you may not feel some of the other ones, right? But it's like if we give you something actually for your kit, it's gonna be much more pronounced. It's gonna be
Right.
something that actually like cuts through. And also that's actually the thing from what we've seen over time. It's going to make the biggest change to that hero's, performance or survivability or whatever it may be, is actually just changing something on the kit itself. Right.
Right.
So I
And
think
and I
that's where
think
we're
people
gonna
like
lean
that.
more. Yeah.
Okay, so that's good to
Yeah.
know because I think that's the big complaint with the passive is like it's good, but it doesn't make me enjoy playing the character anymore.
Yeah.
Right? Like a Winston might benefit from the reduced crit, but that doesn't make I don't feel enjoyment out of benefiting from that. Right? Okay,
Yeah. No,
that's good
totally.
to know. That's good to know.
Yeah. So I think it'll be kind of like a dual approach because there's still some things we want to tune with those, but if it we have to make sure that there's changes for those heroes as an individual hero that allow them to feel better too.
That's really, really good to hear. I think a lot of people are going to be very happy to hear that. Okay, so what is the team's stance and how a solo tank should feel? We talked about this earlier with terms of the CC with Wrecking Ball. I think the psychology in 5v5 of having only the one imposing figure on the field often means that the tank can be the center of attention with counter swapping, with debuffs, with damage focus. And yet at the same time, we have, frankly, tank is the most effective person on the field. They have the most expansive kits, the largest health pools. They just struggle with the amount of attention they get. Yeah. So you could be the most effective person in the battlefield, and yet it feels the worst as a solo tank. Is there anything that you guys have? I know this is a tricky topic that you guys have in terms of individual balance approach to the solo tank experience.
Yeah, as I said earlier, like our next patch is going to focus on that in particular.
Okay.
Hopefully make that experience even better. But our philosophy is like it's the carry, not the chore. You know, I think once you get to that element of like, if you're not feeling satisfied, you're not actually, living in the success of your team. You're just not having as much fun as some of the rest of the players in the match, right?
Yes.
But you're right. Some of our philosophies like tanks do set the rules of engagement, right? They are these big bruisers, right? They are this thing that we emphasize. There's a bit more decision making in terms of your position, in terms of how you take engagements, than maybe some of the other roles I have because they dictate, a little bit of the flow of an engagement. But we're going to be focusing on their playing capabilities and their defensive capabilities on a hero by hero basis, and
that's great.
Hopefully, that next patch hits pretty well. But that's what we're currently working on because we see it. I do think they don't feel like they can make as many plays offensively and defensively to for themselves, and I think that's what we're gonna be looking at. Yeah.
Okay, that's really good here because as I said, it's like they are very effective, but they're very effective at manipulating attention so much so that you can be effective and not be having fun, and I think that's scary. So that's awesome, and you said hero by hero a lot of it as well.
Yeah, and the objective there is not to make them unkillable, but just to make sure they have more playmaking ability, more decision making.
You're not going to give every tank a Rissa Fortify.
We'll see.
Okay. Oh, no. Okay. I guess we've touched on this one a lot, so we can skim through this one already. But how much importance does the team place on psychological factors dictating decisions rather than objective balance? We talked about this just with tank. We talked about this with meta, right? How people will be very quick to latch onto something. Do you guys all have masters in psychology? Do you guys factor any of this into your decision making? I assume the answer is yes, but
yes. I mean, if we hear that people aren't enjoying the game, even though we see this like perfect state of balance or whatever it may be, we're going to act, right? I think it's not about even technically, right? It's about like people enjoying Overwatch as much as possible, and that's on like a hero kit basis. That's on like a meta basis. So I think it is the most important thing is like how are players, are they feeling when they're playing the game?
Sure.
Are they playing the game, right?
Sure.
Is that are they engaging with it the way we want them to? So
sure.
I think it trumps everything else, right?
Yeah, so. Absolutely. That's a tricky one though, because you are again, it tends to snowball very quickly.
We can't be too reactive at the same time,
right?
I do think that's like also a responsibility. It's not just swing as a pendulum back and forth. There's things we want like some consistency in the game from season to season, things like that, right? Because you can understand it better. Yeah.
Sure. A few last questions here. So talk to me about pickable passives if you can. I know this is coming up here soon. But this one was again another one of those curveballs that I never would have guessed in a million years, and yet had a lot of people talking. Like, wow, this is really interesting. I wonder what they're gonna do.
Yeah. So for the event, you're going to come in and each role is going to have these 3 additional passives that you can choose from. So you can like. She come in is like, oh, do I want more ammo or do I want something else? Like on DPS, do I want to like see critical enemies through walls, right? And we're going to talk about like what those may be later. But we're really sort of testing some things, testing some gameplay systems. A lot of it's about like, okay, is this choice interesting for players to make? Are they changing their choice based on what the enemy's playing? Is this something they'll do before they switch their hero? right? Is this something where they can
Right.
play like a slightly different variation of a hero before they just actually make a counter swap? And does that feel good for them, right? Do they feel like there's decision making there? Is the flow of it good? Like when you're actually in respawn, you like want to switch, can you do it quick enough, or you feel like you're not wasting time? If there's things like that. But we're testing out some, gameplay systems, and this like is like a kind of a
Cool.
small look into something bigger we might do in the future of what that may be, depending on like
Sure.
how it goes and some of the feedback. But
Okay.
yeah, I think we're always testing something. I think this is a bigger quick play hack than we normally do, but we think this one's at least gonna like be a good conversation piece for everybody.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So since season 11, we initially had this interview scheduled, I believe, before season 11 or right at it.
Yeah.
Now we're coming with the retrospective, having the last 5, 6 days, 7 days, maybe even longer actually, of practice and trying out different things. Any initial first takes here? Anything cooking behind the scene here? Tell me what you can.
I mean, a lot of it's rather expected, right? I think like Roadhog's down significantly, Sojourn's down significantly. Where's that Sojourn play rate going? It's like we're starting to
Right.
see Ashe pop up a little bit. Symmetra's up, Ari's up, Darker Queen's on that rise. I think the one everyone's kind of aware of that we have our eyes on too is like Pharah's like rise. It just
Yep.
continues to trend upward and upward. But Illari rising very quickly too, and I think Illari is gaining a lot from a lot of the changes we had. There's also been the the return to peak mercy effect, even in ranked. You start to see that. You're like, oh, okay, like there's a lot more mercies even in comp. So like popularity, like the last 2 days, like whoop,
Yeah.
I was like, oh, interesting.
Yeah.
It's not just about getting quick play. It's like, oh, they want to play mercy and competitive as
Yeah.
well. But yeah, those are some of the things that are happening. We're pretty happy overall of like how I think there's a lot of diversity in the meta right now. I think Cassidy
Sure.
obviously is very, very popular. But outside of that, I think there's a lot of role diversity.
All right. I'm going to ask the tough one.
Yeah,
Mauga.
yeah, no,
There's the word on the street is that
Word on the street.
there's a philosophy that people say Roadhog, Orisa, Mauga. One of these guys is always meta. One of these guys is always meta. Now, I've been actually out of town. I've not played much ranked at all. But is that something that you guys are aware of? Obviously, Roadhog weaker, Orisa's still pretty bad. What's Mauga looking like right now behind
He's
under
kind
the
of
hood?
he's kind of like average slash slightly below average, right? I would
Okay.
say. Play rate isn't up there with the top ones by any means.
Okay.
I think doing better in like pretty coordinated environments. But at the same time, we are looking at some things longer term for Mauga. I think
Okay.
there may be tweaking along the way, but we're looking at particularly like cardiac overdrive and what we want to do
Yep.
with that ability.
Great.
We've run some experience before, but maybe there's some bigger things, bigger steps we can take. And looking at, hey, like how effectively can he set squishies on fire, and can we bring that effectiveness into the kits somewhere else? So
Yep.
looking at some of that as well,
Okay.
I think that would give him more reward for diving some of
Sure.
those characters and feel like he can accomplish that without having to shoot them a bunch before he gets to the ignite, things of that nature.
Sure. Broad question here, just one I threw in at the last minute. There's a lot of bugs. I think people are. Quaked is always talking about Doomfist bugs, and people are talking about Genji bugs, and there's this bugs. I know this may not be specifically your department, although you do have a little hand in everything. Are you aware of any bug fixes, map tweaks, anything that, whether it's environmental goof ups or cooldown interactions, are you aware of any tweaks that are going on behind the scenes to address some of these minor but annoying quality of life things?
I mean, that's constantly happening, right? Like our
Right.
QA teams like fixing things. A lot of times what happens, like some of the ones that aren't, immediately need to get fixed, they'll get fixed the next season. I think we can do a better job of like raising and like highlighting like when those things did change. I think like we've actually changed some things on Doofus with some of the some of the lockout time recently, right? But I'm not sure it was like in the patch notes fully, right?
Sure.
So there's like things like that. I think we can do a better job of making sure there's awareness when those things get fixed. But it's something that
Sure.
our QA team is constantly doing. There's just stuff coming in all the
Sure.
time.
Sure. Sure. Last question here. Anything that you want to be asked about? Anything we haven't talked
I want to
about?
be asked about.
Anything that
God,
you were here excited, amped up, spent about 7 hours preparing a long speech for, and it turns out I didn't ask the question.
No, I think all your questions are really good. Like, I'm excited when we can finally start sharing more about our next heroes, like in the future. Like, that's something that gets
Sure.
me really excited. So,
Sure.
we're not
Sure.
that far
Oh,
away yet, right? But
I thought of one
things
thing.
like that. All right, go.
Is there any, you can say no, I won't get my feelings hurt. Is there anything that you can share us about either A, some of the upcoming tank tweaks, or B, Space Ranger?
Okay, so I'll try to repeat some things that were said at BlizzCon for Space Ranger, where high mobility, versatile support that's still very intact, right? That's very much what her playstyle is going to be about, and she brings some utility that is in the support cast that only one character has at the moment. So that's going to be a lot of fun. The game's going to be really fast. It's going to get really fast.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. No comment there. And the anything with the tank?
Yeah, I mean, kind of outlined some of those like individual things.
Okay.
I'm trying to think what was like. They're not like finalized yet, so I'm trying to think like what was the one the biggest ones.
Roadhog has 4 take a breathers now. Interchangeably. Get some CC
I don't think
immunity.
Roadhog's going to get more defensive capabilities. I don't think that's what he's going to get in particular. I was running through them in my head, which one, like Winston, we're looking at like how to make the ultimate a little bit better, and how to like maybe the right click can be a bit more responsive. Doesn't need to take as long as it does to charge at the moment. Things like that.
Okay.
We can like
That's exciting.
Tap some targets a little bit quicker.
Okay.
Reinhardt, still working through like Reinhardt, but like can charge V300 damage again. I think that's like one of the ones we're looking at where it's like, okay, now it's going to hit most of the characters in the cast.
That's exciting.
Stuff like that.
That's exciting. That's going to get a lot of people, I think, talking. Well, Alec, I guess that's basically it, man. I really, really appreciate your time. This was obviously super, super generous of you. For those of you guys in chat, this was, obviously not necessarily something that needed to be scheduled, but was very generous of you to offer to do. And obviously, the second I was offered, I was like, all right, I gotta go. I gotta start writing as many questions as I can here. But yeah,
and thank you,
Alec,
thank you for like taking all the time to do that. Writing all the questions. I think they were really great. So,
of course. Again, this is great, man. Phenomenal. Well, have a good rest of your week. Looking forward to some of the upcoming changes. Quick play. The quick play hack stuff, the new hero, of course, down the road. And if you guys haven't already as well, big shout out to obviously the Breast Cancer Research Fund, the Mercy Scan. Obviously, there's Mercy pick rate is skyrocketed, but it's 100% of that is going to a good cause, which is incredibly generous of you guys. So that's awesome to hear. So, Alec, appreciate your time. Have a great rest of your day.
Cheers. Thank you, everybody.
Cheers. Bye-bye.